As smoke cleared from the unexpected attack on the American forces at Pearl Harbor in December 1941 by the Imperial Japanese Navy, the United States faced an urgent challenge: how to halt the relentless expansion of the Japanese Empire across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. What would become the Pacific theatre of World War II was unlike any other battlefield in history. It spanned thousands of miles of open ocean, hundreds of remote islands, and incomprehensibly dense jungles. As a result, both the United States and Japan had to develop new strategies for seeking out and defeating each other across massive stretches of water. In reality, it would mean that a few crucial victories could quickly become pivotal moments, determining who would hold the balance of power in the region. In this video, we will explore the three most significant sea battles in this theatre: Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. The first major Pacific Sea battle between the US and Japanese navies after Pearl Harbor occurred near Australia in the Coral Sea. It was fought between May 4th and 8th of 1942. In the previous month, the Japanese were poised to seize control of the Coral Sea in order to extend their defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. Their main interest was to control Papua New Guinea. On the 3rd of May, the Japanese had landed ground troops at Tulagi and sent their ships into the Coral Sea. They were heading towards its capital city of Port Moresby, intending to support their troops. However, an American naval task force, which was comprised of US and one Australian ship, was ready to intercept them. Thanks to a tip-off by Signals Intelligence, the US Navy dispatched Task Force 17, led by USS Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, and Task Force 11, led by USS Lexington under Rear Admiral Aubrey B. Fitch, to counter the Japanese advance. This would be the first ever aircraft carrier battle and the first naval battle in history where both sides fought without ever directly sighting each other's ships. On May 5th and 6th, 1942, the opposing carrier groups conducted extensive reconnaissance flights to try and find each other, but had limited success due to poor weather. Then, on the morning of May 7th, the two fleets finally launched their attacks. The Japanese carrier Shoho became the first casualty. A squadron of American bombers from the Lexington and the Yorktown delivered a devastating attack with bombs and torpedoes. The carrier was quickly engulfed in flames and sank, which was the first time a Japanese carrier was neutralized by American forces in World War II. Also, the American forces significantly damaged the Japanese carrier Shokaku. Another Japanese carrier, the Zuikaku, suffered heavy losses to its air group. For the US, the Lexington was heavily damaged and later scuttled after fires broke out, while the Yorktown was damaged, but later repaired at Pearl Harbor. In the end, since the Japanese ships were further away from resources and supplies, they retreated from the Coral Sea. The Allies claimed victory, and as a result, the United States and Australia were able to prevent the Japanese from advancing further south toward Port Moresby in New Guinea. It may have also stopped a possible future invasion of the Australian mainland too. With the loss of sea support, the Japanese attempt to capture Papua New Guinea would now focus on a land campaign that would become known as the Battle of the Kokoda Track. Despite the setback in the Coral Sea, the Japanese still had a powerful fleet and were fully aware of the growing power of the American Navy. In response, they chose to be proactive and try to deal another decisive blow on the US, as they had tried to do at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, was placed in charge of a new advance on the island atoll of Midway, in the middle of the Pacific, which was a crucial American military base. To do this, the Japanese wanted to set a trap for the United States fleet. They would attack the island of Midway, and since it was relatively isolated, it was hoped that the United States would send their new ships to defend it. The trap worked, and when news of the impending attack reached the United States, they did indeed dispatch their fleet. However, the US Pacific Fleet's commander, Admiral Chester Nimitz, had been warned of Japanese ambush plans since the Japanese secret military code had recently been cracked. As a result, Nimitz knew in detail the Japanese movements, as well as the size and strength of his opponent's forces. So, he was able to lay a counter-trap for them. Nimitz chose to deploy 3 carrier groups, including the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown. This battle would become one of the largest naval engagements of the entire war. On the morning of June 4, 1942, which was just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft struck the Midway Atoll, causing damage but failing to neutralize the base. However, it became clear that the Japanese were not aware of just how close the American carriers were until it was too late. Within an hour of the initial attack, the American aircraft were in the skies, ready to retaliate. Due to the confusion around the sheer size and speed of the American response, Japanese Admiral Nagumo had to make rapid decisions about whether to launch a second strike on Midway or respond to the escalating American carrier attack. This indecision left Japanese aircraft on the decks of the carriers, fully armed and fueled, which made them susceptible to catastrophic damage when American dive bombers struck. In addition, groups of US torpedo bombers intentionally drew Japanese fighters away from their ships, which depleted their combat air patrol. This allowed American dive bombers to then attack with minimal interference. So, by late morning, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown were able to disable 3 Japanese carriers in the space of just 5 minutes, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The remaining Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was able to launch a counterattack, which severely damaged the Yorktown. However, due to the sinking of so many Japanese carriers, aircraft returning to refuel and rearm could not find their ships anywhere. With no place to land, the planes had to be ditched in the ocean and lost. So, by the end of the first day, the Japanese had lost all 4 of their aircraft carriers, as well as 248 aircraft and over 3,000 men. This was a catastrophic defeat for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the last remaining ships tried to escape as quickly as possible. On the next day, June 6th, Rear Admiral Spruance pursued the retreating Japanese, and his forces sank the cruiser Mikuma and damaged other ships. In comparison, the Americans had suffered approximately 307 casualties and just 1 aircraft carrier. It was the USS Yorktown, which had been damaged on June 4th and again on June 6th by a Japanese submarine, before finally rolling over and sinking on the morning of June the 7th. This had been a decisive victory for the Americans, and it crippled the Japanese Navy. Japan would never again regain its dominance in the Pacific. Midway also allowed the United States to transition from a defensive posture to a more aggressive strategy. This would be the start of a series of offensive operations. As US control of the Pacific slowly increased following the Battle of Midway, the American forces started targeting key islands to drive back the Japanese. To achieve this, they relied upon both the Navy and the ground forces. One of the most important locations at this time was Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese had captured Guadalcanal in May 1942 and quickly began building an airport at Lunga Point that was intended to be used as a base to threaten Allied supply routes between the United States and Australia. However, when US Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, they encountered little resistance and secured the airfield the following day. Rather than destroying the facility, the US decided to try and complete it and use it as their own launching point for future air operations against Japanese positions. The airstrip would be renamed Henderson Field by the Americans in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator who was killed at the Battle of Midway. However, the Japanese did not want to lose a valuable asset so easily and made a concerted effort to stop the American plans. Throughout August, the Japanese Navy and Air Force continually bombed and attacked the American forces who had no place to hide on the small island. However, this seemed to have little effect as the construction continued. Then the Japanese experienced a key victory at Savo Island from August 8th to 9 against an Allied fleet and sunk 4 American cruisers. This left the Allies temporarily vulnerable in the region. So, the Japanese made several attempts to land soldiers on Guadalcanal, but they were always fought off, resulting in high casualties. Henderson Field was finally ready for use on August 20th. As a result, 31 Marine aircraft, including Wildcat fighters and Dauntless dive bombers, were relocated there. This group of aircraft were named the Cactus Air Force and could now provide crucial air support to the Marines. This led to a sudden increase in Japanese casualties and damage to their ships. In response, during September, the Japanese began operating at night, hoping that the darkness would minimize the Allied aircraft's effectiveness. In particular, the Japanese sent fast destroyers to shell the island and drop supplies to reinforce their troops on Guadalcanal. These nightly naval bombardments happened so regularly that they were nicknamed the Tokyo Express by the US forces. However, the Japanese were never able to achieve any success with this strategy and failed to ever deliver sufficient troops and supplies to recapture the island. On the 11th of October, a Japanese fleet arrived off Cape Esperance to reinforce their men. However, US forces intercepted and defeated them. In the face of this setback, Japan decided to make a massive concerted effort to overwhelm the Americans and seize back the island. On November 12th, they launched air attacks on US ships delivering reinforcements to Guadalcanal. However, during a night surface engagement, the outnumbered US forces managed to disrupt the Japanese bombardment force and prevented damage to Henderson Field. The next day, Japanese forces attempted another bombardment, but US aircraft from Henderson Field sunk several Japanese ships and transports. Then, on the 14th of November, Japan attempted a final shelling of Henderson Field, but the US destroyed the vital battleship Kirishima, as well as several other vessels. This failure effectively ended Japanese efforts to reinforce their soldiers, still stuck on the island. By December 1942, the isolated Japanese men were suffering from malnutrition and disease, with an estimated 50 of them dying every day. Running low on resources, and with less ability to sustain operations in the South Pacific, by November the Japanese finally gave up. On the 31st of December, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters decided to evacuate their forces from Guadalcanal, which was only completed in early February of 1943. The Guadalcanal campaign was one of the bloodiest campaigns in the entire Pacific theatre. The Japanese lost approximately 25,000 men, and the Americans around 7,000. Ultimately, the Japanese had suffered significant losses for no discernible tactical benefit. As a result of these three sea battles in 1942, the United States Navy was able to take strategic control of important parts of the Pacific. While the Japanese still controlled strategic locations in the west, including Singapore and the Philippines, the devastation to their navy meant that they were increasingly limited in their capacity to supply and support these regions. However, it would still take 2 more years of brutal fighting before the Americans could reach Japan and try to force a surrender. One of the most important lessons these battles highlighted was the industrial capacity of the United States in comparison to the Japanese. The US were ultimately able to replace their lost ships and planes at a pace that the Japanese could not match. By 1944, America knew that they could win a protracted war in the Pacific based primarily on their ability to outproduce their opponents. I hope that you've enjoyed learning about the battles in the Pacific during World War II. If you would like to know more, please visit the History Skills website. I look forward to seeing you again in our next video.